What you're about to hear almost never makes the news, and that's exactly why it matters. Mexico just did something that very few governments in the Western Hemisphere have had the spine to do. It pushed back against Chinese economic penetration at the most sensitive level possible, its own national resources. And when a country draws that line, you don't just have a trade dispute, you have a geopolitical confrontation dressed in legal clothing. Here's what's really happening. China has been systematically acquiring access to strategic minerals, rare earths, and resource corridors across Latin America for over a decade. This isn't investment. This is infrastructure for leverage. It's the same playbook used in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific. Move in quietly through commercial channels, lock up the resources, and by the time the host nation realizes what's been signed away, the dependency is already structural. Mexico, sitting on some of the world's most significant deposits of lithium, the defining resource of the 21st century energy transition, just became the front line of a much larger battle. And the implications for US strategic interests, for global power realignment, and for the countries brave enough to say no are enormous. Let's break down exactly what happened, who's really behind it, and what it tells us about where the world is actually heading. So, let's start with the resource itself, because that's where every serious geopolitical story actually begins. Not with the politics, but with what's underneath the ground. Lithium. If you've been following global economics with any seriousness over the past decade, you already know this word carries enormous weight. But I want to make sure we're all operating with the same understanding here, because the mainstream media tends to reduce this conversation to electric vehicles and climate goals, and that framing, deliberately or not, completely misses the strategic depth of what's actually at stake. Lithium is not just a battery material. Lithium is power. It is the foundational element of the modern energy architecture that every major military, every major economy, and every serious geopolitical actor on the planet is now scrambling to control. When we talk about the energy transition, and I want you to hold that phrase loosely because it means very different things to very different people, what we're really talking about is a fundamental restructuring of which nations hold leverage over the global economy for the next 100 years. Oil gave certain nations extraordinary influence throughout the 20th century. Lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, these are the oil fields of the 21st century, and Mexico is sitting on one of the largest lithium reserves on Earth. Now here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, and where I think most analysts fail to connect the dots properly. When China began its systematic resource acquisition campaign across the developing world, it wasn't operating randomly. There was, and continues to be, a clear strategic logic at work. China's leadership, and I'm talking about the long-term institutional thinking that operates across decades rather than election cycles, identified very early that the nation which controls critical mineral supply chains controls the commanding heights of the future global economy. You don't need aircraft carriers for that kind of dominance. You need contracts, you need infrastructure investment, you need patient capital, and you need governments willing to accept your terms. That strategy worked extraordinarily well in Africa. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, which holds roughly 70% of the world's cobalt reserves, Chinese entities now control a significant portion of mining operations. In Zambia, in Zimbabwe, across the resource-rich nations of sub-Saharan Africa, the pattern repeats itself with remarkable consistency. Chinese state-backed firms arrive with infrastructure offers, roads, ports, railways, hospitals, stadiums, and in exchange, they secure long-term access to mineral extraction rights. On the surface, it looks like development. Underneath, it's dependency architecture. By the time a government realizes the terms of the arrangement are working against its own national interest, the infrastructure is already built, the debt is already owed, and the leverage has already shifted. China then applied this same playbook to Latin America, and for a long time, it worked there too. Ecuador borrowed heavily from Chinese institutions and found itself navigating extremely uncomfortable financial obligations. Argentina, perpetually in economic crisis, became increasingly susceptible to Chinese financial influence. Bolivia, which holds perhaps the largest lithium reserves in the world in the Salar de Uyuni, went through a period of significant political turbulence, and the question of who would ultimately control that lithium was never far from the surface of that turbulence. These are not coincidences, these are patterns, and patterns tell you about intent. Mexico, however, presents a different and genuinely fascinating case. And this is where President Claudia Sheinbaum, who took office in late 2024 following the transformative tenure of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, widely known as AMLO, enters the picture in a way that deserves real analytical attention. AMLO spent years trying to reassert Mexican state control over its own energy and resource sector. His administration nationalized aspects of the lithium industry, creating a state entity called LitioMX, specifically designed to ensure that Mexican lithium would be extracted and managed under Mexican state authority rather than handed over to foreign corporations. Now, you might instinctively frame that through an ideological lens, and many commentators in Washington certainly did, painting it as leftist resource nationalism. But I'd ask you to step back from that framing for a moment and consider it from a different angle. What AMLO was actually doing, whatever his broader political failings or successes, was recognizing something strategically sound, that a country's natural resources are its sovereign wealth, and surrendering control of that wealth to foreign entities, whether American, Chinese, European, or anyone else, is a form of strategic self-harm. Now, the specific confrontation that brought this to international attention involves a set of mining concessions that had been granted to Chinese-linked entities in Mexican territory containing significant lithium deposits, particularly in the state of Sonora. The Sonora lithium deposit is genuinely world-class. Geologists have estimated it as one of the largest hard rock lithium deposits ever identified. And when the Mexican government, under the framework established by AMLO's administration, began reviewing these concessions, examining whether they were consistent with the nationalization framework, whether the terms served Mexican national interests, whether the legal basis for the grants was sound, what emerged was a dispute that cut straight to the heart of 21st century geopolitical competition. The Chinese entities involved did not simply accept this review quietly. That would be out of character for any major state-backed corporate interest facing the potential loss of access to a deposit of this scale. There were legal challenges, there were diplomatic pressures, and there was the broader context of China's economic relationship with Mexico, which is substantial and growing. China is Mexico's second largest trading partner. The supply chains that feed Mexico's manufacturing sector, particularly in electronics and industrial goods, are deeply interwoven with Chinese production. That's leverage. That's the kind of leverage that makes any government think twice before blocking a Chinese corporate interest, because the blowback potential across other dimensions of the bilateral relationship is real. And yet Mexico moved forward. And that decision, that choice to absorb potential economic friction in order to protect sovereign control over a strategic resource, is the part of this story that I think deserves the most serious reflection. Because here's what it signals. We are living through a moment in history where the old rules of economic globalization, the rules that said open markets, foreign investment, and comparative advantage would produce universal prosperity, are visibly breaking down. Nation after nation is looking at its resource base, looking at its strategic vulnerabilities, and making a calculation that looked different 20 years ago than it does today. The calculation today is this. In a world where great power competition is intensifying, where supply chain weaponization has already been demonstrated, we saw it with semiconductors, we saw it with pharmaceutical ingredients during COVID, sovereign control over critical resources is not an ideological luxury, it is a survival strategy. Mexico's move fits into a broader pattern that I've been watching develop across multiple regions simultaneously. You have Indonesia restricting nickel exports to force value-added processing to happen on Indonesian soil, rather than simply exporting raw ore to be processed in China. You have Chile and Argentina, together with Bolivia, forming the so-called lithium triangle, which holds perhaps 60% of the world's identified lithium reserves. Moving toward greater state involvement in their lithium sectors, you have the European Union scrambling to sign critical mineral agreements with resource-rich nations before Chinese entities lock up supply, and you have the United States belatedly beginning to recognize that decades of treating critical mineral supply chains as someone else's problem has created genuine national security vulnerabilities. This is the world Mexico is navigating, and it's navigating it under enormous pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. On one side, you have China, which has economic leverage through trade relationships and which has demonstrated in other contexts a willingness to apply economic pressure when its interests are challenged. The restrictions on Australian barley and wine after Australia called for a COVID investigation being a reasonably instructive recent example. On the other side, you have the United States, which under the current political environment has been applying its own significant pressures on Mexico around border security, drug trafficking, and trade terms. And Mexico sits in the middle, trying to chart a course that serves Mexican interests in a world where the two largest economies on earth are engaged in a strategic competition that neither of them is willing to name directly, but both of them are pursuing aggressively. What makes the lithium dispute particularly revealing is what it tells us about the evolving nature of sovereignty itself. For most of the post-World War II period, sovereignty was largely understood in political terms, the right of a nation to govern its own internal affairs without foreign interference. But economic sovereignty, the actual capacity of a nation to direct its own economic future, was progressively eroded by the conditions attached to international capital flows, by trade agreements that constrained policy space, by IMF and World Bank conditionality that effectively transferred economic decision-making authority to external creditors. What we are watching now, in Mexico and in dozens of other resource-rich developing nations, is an attempt to reclaim that economic sovereignty, to say, in practical terms, this is our ground, these are our minerals, and the terms on which they are extracted will be set by us. That is a profound shift, and it carries implications that ripple far beyond any single country or any single resource dispute. Think about what it means for the global investment regime. For decades, multinational corporations, and state-backed Chinese enterprises are a particular variant of this, but Western multinationals played this game long before China arrived on the scene, operated under a framework that gave foreign investors extraordinary protections, bilateral investment treaties, investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, the general assumption that capital mobility trumped national policy discretion. That framework is now under serious stress from multiple directions. When Mexico reviews mining concessions and finds them inconsistent with its national interest, it is participating in a broader renegotiation of the terms under which global capital accesses developing world resources, and the nations doing this renegotiating are increasingly aware of each other, increasingly coordinating, and increasingly confident that the old framework served capital far more than it served them. Now I want to be careful here, not to romanticize what's happening. Asserting national control over resources does not automatically translate into good outcomes for ordinary citizens. Resource nationalism has a complicated historical record. The revenues from state-controlled extraction can be captured by corrupt elites just as easily, often more easily, than in private sector models. The management challenges of running a state mining enterprise at world-class operational standards are genuinely difficult, and the geopolitical assertiveness of a government protecting its lithium doesn't guarantee that the lithium will actually be developed in a way that benefits the Mexican people broadly rather than a narrower set of political and economic interests. These are real concerns. They deserve honest engagement rather than being waved away with nationalist rhetoric, but, and this is crucial, they are concerns about implementation, not about the fundamental legitimacy of the underlying principle. A nation having sovereign control over its own critical resources is not the problem. What happens next, how that control is exercised, who benefits and who doesn't, that is where the real work lies. And here's where the American dimension of this story deserves serious attention, because I think it's the piece that most American viewers may not have fully considered. The United States has an extraordinary interest in what happens with Mexican lithium. Not just because Mexico is a neighbor and major trading partner, though both of those things matter enormously, but because the United States is trying to build out domestic and allied critical mineral supply chains as part of its own strategic competition with China. The Inflation Reduction Act, whatever its other political controversies, included significant provisions specifically designed to incentivize the development of critical mineral supply chains within the United States or among its free trade agreement partners. Mexico is a free trade agreement partner. Mexican lithium, if developed under terms favorable to the United States and Mexico jointly, could be a significant asset in America's attempt to reduce its dependence on Chinese-controlled supply chains. But, and this is where it gets genuinely complicated, American corporations pursuing Mexican lithium on terms that effectively replicate the extractive dynamic that Mexico is trying to move away from would be not just morally problematic but strategically self-defeating. If Washington wants Mexico as a genuine partner in critical mineral supply chain development, it needs to offer terms that give Mexico real economic benefit, real technology transfer, real processing capacity built on Mexican soil. It cannot simply demand access to Mexican resources as a cheaper alternative to dealing with China, while offering Mexico nothing more than a different flag on the extraction operation. That distinction between genuine partnership and rebranded extraction is one that Mexican policymakers are acutely aware of, and it should be one that serious American strategists are equally aware of, even if the political incentives in Washington often push toward the simpler demand rather than the more sophisticated partnership framework. What we are watching in this Mexico-China lithium dispute is, in microcosm, the central tension of the emerging world order, a world where the assumptions of the last 30 years, that economic integration would produce convergence, that global supply chains would bind nations together in mutual dependency, that reduced conflict, that capital markets would allocate resources more efficiently than national governments, has been revealed as inadequate. Not entirely wrong, but inadequate. And where the replacement framework, the rules and norms that will govern international economic relations in this more competitive, more fragmented, more contested world is still being written. Mexico, in blocking this Chinese move, is writing a small but genuinely significant line in that emerging framework. It is asserting that national treasures, and lithium is absolutely a national treasure in the most literal sense of that phrase, belong to the nation, that their development should serve national interests. That foreign capital is welcome as a partner, but not as a sovereign. Whether Mexico can sustain that position, whether it has the institutional capacity, the political will, the financial independence to see it through under pressure from both China and the United States, is a genuinely open question. History is full of examples of governments that made bold resource sovereignty moves and then found themselves unable to sustain them against sustained external pressure. But the fact that the move was made at all in the current environment with the current stakes tells you something important. Something is shifting in how developing nations perceive their position in the global order. The deference that once characterized their relationship with major power capital is eroding, and the countries that understand this shift earliest, that recognize what's happening and position themselves accordingly, will find themselves with strategic options that their predecessors simply did not have. That's not a small thing. That is, in fact, the central drama of the world we are living in right now. And stories like this one, a lithium dispute in the Mexican desert, or where that drama becomes most visible, most concrete, and most consequential. Pay attention to them.